Technology is accelerating our world faster than we have the bandwidth to keep up. With delivery drones, artificial intelligence, driverless cars, and reusable rockets exiting and re-entering our atmosphere. Meanwhile, here on Earth, rapid changes to consumer behavior, technology, and data are driving business operations. And leaders know the success they seek stands on the shoulders of the technology they use. The question is, why are businesses still using old technology for this new world? It's time to rethink everything. Today's work from anywhere practice is making corporate security a nightmare, as the internet has become a part of the corporate network. Teams are no longer behind the company's firewall, but at home, moving through airports using public Wi-Fi, or in online meetings at coffee shops. The corporate firewall is no longer the primary defense. The ideal security solution is one that follows the user, so that they and the company's assets are protected wherever they go. Everyone is talking about the cloud, but moving to the cloud isn't a destination. It's an operating model and a massive strategic advantage. You want to scale up and bring new products to market faster? Then modernize your data center and create your own hybrid cloud infrastructure with all the strength of the cloud, but with greater control, security, and flexibility. It's time to rethink your IT infrastructure. Changes in consumer behavior are driving digital transformation initiatives, and consumers are calling the shots. They determine where, when, and how they want to interact. And if you don't cater to these consumer demands, they'll move on to someone who does. In this new world, data is the oxygen for business. How long can your business survive without access to its digital assets? How long can you hold your breath? Business operations must continue, even in the face of a disruption. That's IT resilience. Your business always on. We are business efficiency consultants operating at the intersection of commerce and technology. For more than 20 years, we have been working with private and public sector entities like you, guiding them safely through new business inflection points, improving operational efficiencies through technology. We provide solutions that help you to future-proof your business. We get it. You have done things that have made you a leader in your industry, but what got you here won't necessarily get you there. The pace and scale of change in this new world is an urgent call for you to initiate your own controlled disruption so that it works for your unique business operation. It's time to rethink everything.
There we go. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. On behalf of Gordon McGrath, attorneys at law, Fraser, Fontaine, and Kong Insurance Company, and Info Exchange Limited, IT consultants and service providers, we welcome you to this, the first Data, Privacy, and Protection Summit, the Business Impact. My name is Anne-Marie Walter-Allen. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer for Info Exchange, and I'm going to be your facilitator this morning. We have a lot of information to give you this morning, and I want to make sure that I don't miss out on anything. So forgive me if from time to time you see me, go looking at my notes. All right, so data privacy is a huge issue this morning. Today, everybody's talking about it. As a matter of fact, we have over 400 persons who have registered for this event, just to show you the level of interest. And we're very happy to have every single one of you here. But let's just take a step back and look at what took us to where we are today. And we can go back to May 25 in 2018, when the European Union enacted their general data protection regulation, which changed everything. And I just want to make sure that I get this right. They're regulating the GDPR. I'm talking about the GDPR. They regulate how companies across the world handle their customers' personal information. It's created a strengthened and unified data protection for all individuals in the EU. So if you're going to do business with them, no matter where in the world you are, you fall under this regulation. So that's the EU. The USA also has their set of regulations. It's not a single overarching legislation, but their Fair Trading Commission has is empowered to enforce federal privacy and data protection regulations. So these are two of Jamaica's leading trading partners who already have pretty strict laws in place with regards to data privacy and data protection. So it's no surprise that Jamaica would have to develop its own Data Protection Act, not only just for ourselves and for the things that we ought to be doing right, but for us to be able to trade and do business with the rest of the world. But what was a surprise, though, was that the Data Protection Act that we have has come out with some pretty strict laws, some pretty strict, severe restrictions. Some say even more restrictive than the GDPR, but I'll let our attorney handle that aspect of it. So that's what we're here to discuss today. Jamaica's Data Protection Act. We want to know, we're going to discuss its impact on business, what to do, how to protect your business, your company's data, your customers' private information, and also what to do should all of your plans fall through and you have to recover somehow. We have a full slate in front of us, so let's settle in. But before I introduce my first speaker, let me just do a little housekeeping. For security purposes, only the panelists and speakers are going to be allowed to talk. However, all participants, that's you, will be able to ask your questions through the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen. Just click it and you can pose your question through that window. You can put your questions at any time, but we will only be going to them at the end of each presentation. Okay. We have three main presenters today, but we also have persons, a set of panelists who from time to time may come in and ask their own questions or make comments. I'm just asking those panelists that if they do speak, that they turn their cameras on and also introduce themselves, their names, and the company that they represent. All right, so that's enough chatter. Let me just get this show on the road. Our first speaker today is Roderick Gordon from Gordon McGrath Attorneys at Law. Let me just go to my notes here. Roderick Gordon is an experienced attorney who has advised clients on technology-related legal issues over the last 15 years. His expertise lies in intellectual property law and regulatory compliance. Roderick has had presentations at various international events, including Brazil and Senegal, where he was invited by the World Intellectual Property Office to speak about IP rights. He has advised regulators and has assisted with the review and amendment of legislation, as well as the interpretation of legislation in matters before the court. We are very fortunate to have Roderick with us this morning. Roderick Gordon, ladies and gentlemen, over to you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Good morning to everyone who has joined. Good morning to the panelists. We're really grateful that you all would take the time in the beginning of your day to join us. So we will try to enlighten you as to what are the rules of digital engagement. What is data protection about? Anne-Marie has spoken quite pointedly to the fact that both our partners in the EU as well as the United States have similar regulations. So part of what our Act seeks to do is to ensure that we are not just protecting data of our data subjects that may be present in Jamaica, but also data that may be processed in Jamaica for data subjects who are not Jamaicans. And we'll come to that definition a little later, but I think it's important to note. We are going through, some would say we are well into the fourth industrial revolution, this information technology age, this e-commerce age. And what we have to do is to recalibrate how we think. We have already recalibrated how we interact with our customers, but we now have to recalibrate how we think about our customers and their data. Data is you know, it's lighter than tissue paper. It's out there. A lot of us don't think twice about sharing our data, about where our data goes. And what the Data Protection Act is doing is ensuring now that everyone who deals with personal data, of the definition is called data subjects, understand the responsibilities and obligations they have. And if you fail with those obligations, there are fines, there are penalties, and you can also be open to personal suit from someone who feels you've breached the rights that they have to their data. So let's start with our disclaimer. This presentation has been prepared by Gordon McGrath, attorneys at law, for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. This presentation shall not be construed as an offer to represent you, nor is it intended to create, nor shall the receipt of such information constitute an attorney-client relationship. All rights are reserved pursuant to the Copyright Act. All right, so it wouldn't be good lawyers if we didn't say that. So let's look now at the objective of our Data Protection Act 2020. This act has been passed, so it is in fact law currently in Jamaica, but it has not yet taken effect. So the actual commencement of the act has not yet begun in terms of it applying to businesses and people who process data, but we'll speak a little more about that later. So what the Act seeks to do is to define the general principles for the treatment of personal data relating to an individual. It provides for the transparent oversight, and it will enable both the public and private sectors to strengthen the protection of personal data. I would remind everyone that certainly for Jamaica, you have a constitutional right to privacy. Okay, so in our Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms, you now have the right to privacy, not just when you're at home, but privacy from of your data, okay? And so our standards actually are a little higher than even in some of the United States territories, the specific states, because they do not have a constitutional right to privacy as we do. The EU GDPR, as Anne-Marie in her introduction indicated, we agreed to a particular treaty, the EPA, and that GDPR, which is what the standard and the regime is called, also seeks to ensure that we protect how we deal with the personal data of citizens of the EU. Okay, so in 2008, along with CARIFORUM states, we signed the CARIFORUM EU Partnership Agreement. And that obliges us to adopt adequate safeguards of the protection and privacy, fundamental rights, and the freedom of individuals, in particular with regard to the transfer of personal data. I'm going to read quickly from the Memorandum of Objects and Reasons, which was delivered when this act was passed in Parliament. A decision has been taken to enact legislation in order to secure confidentiality of personal data which may be in the possession of entities, including government authorities, and to provide for the rights of individuals in relation to their personal data in the possession of those entities. This bill seeks to give effect to that decision and, among other things, establishes the office of an Information Commissioner, charged with the responsibility of overseeing the manner in which personal data in the possession of entities is handled. The EPA, which is the Economic Partnership Agreement, which we entered into in 2008, requires the signatories to establish appropriate legal and regulatory regimes in line with existing high international standards, with a view to ensuring adequate level of protection of individuals with regard to the processing of personal data. So everyone under the EPA has to ensure that they're protecting data for all the member states and their citizens. So I think it's really important for us to understand that why we're saying these are rules of digital engagement is it's not just engaging with your customers who you may deal with online from our shores. It is also for people who are outside of Jamaica. All right, so the regulator is the Information Commissioner. Very interesting title, not unusual. It's a title that has been used under the GDPR as well. And this person is not someone who is under the constabulary force. It is an office which is going to be headed by someone called the Information Commissioner. And this office is charged with, amongst other things, monitoring compliance with the Act. This is the office that businesses and anyone dealing with data as a data controller will have to register with, and we will come to that shortly. Okay, let's look at a summary of key definitions, and I will warn you, the Act is very long. It is currently well over 70 sections. The regulations have not yet been promulgated. I expect the regulations will be another 50 to 100 different sections of regulations. So it's a lot of material, and what we're really trying to do this morning is to really give you the framework and give you the key data points, pardon the pun, that we think will give you a better understanding of the framework, a better understanding of some of the obligations you would have to face so you can prepare for the coming of the Data Protection Act. So first, a data subject is a named or identifiable individual who is a subject of personal data. And that is important. Named or identifiable, as you know, you can share data which is identifiable to you personally, which does not necessarily include your name. So you may share other personal data such as your date of birth, your email address, your home address, other personal data points that when they're pulled together, they identify you as a data subject, which doesn't necessarily include your name. Personal data under the Act is defined as any information from which a living individual or an individual deceased for less than 30 years could be identified from. So as a data controller, you would still have the obligation to maintain the data protection standards for someone who has died, who may have been a client of yours, a customer of yours for less than 30 years from the implementation of this Act. And that is worth noting. Obviously, hospitals, medical facilities will have to pay keen attention to this. Direct marketing is defined as promoting or offering to supply in the ordinary course of business any goods or services or requesting a donation of any kind for any reason. Now, why is this important? That probably is the bread and butter that most businesses currently do on a day-to-day basis with existing customers. Okay, so once you are reaching out to your customers at all by email or through any data that has been provided to you, then you are processing data and you fall under the Act. So who is a data controller? Well, a data controller, ladies and gentlemen, is you. It's any person or public authority who determines the purpose and manner in which personal data is processed. So once you have the consent of a data subject to take their personal data, once you determine how that data is processed, you are the data controller. Anyone who runs a business who collects that personal data is a data controller. What is processing? Processing covers a wide range of operations performed on personal data. It includes the collection of that data, the recording of that data, the organization, the structuring of that data, and it includes the storage of that data. Storage is important, obviously, because some of us use cloud storage. You may decide to use Dropbox or any of these consumer level storage options, and the data may be stored overseas. Well, you have to ensure that it is stored appropriately and that the standards that it is being stored under meet our Data Protection Act. So that's very important, and I'm sure the Info Exchange team will speak a bit on that and better options that may be present that you may wish to consider. All right, so how far does this act reach? The act applies to data controllers established in Jamaica. Okay, so all of us, okay, we do business in Jamaica, our businesses, our offices are here. We are entities that exist in Jamaica. But it also applies to data controllers that are not established in Jamaica. Okay, the act applies if that data controller, I don't know, Amazon, maybe Google, one, uses equipment in Jamaica for processing personal data. Two, processes data of data subjects in Jamaica in order to offer products or services. Or three, monitors behavior of data subjects taking place in Jamaica. And when I read that one, I immediately remembered Cambridge Analytica. I don't know how many of you may have watched the documentary, The Great Hack. That's on Netflix, but one of the more revealing parts of that documentary was the work Cambridge Analytica did in Trinidad and Tobago. And Trinidad are taking legal steps to bring the alleged perpetrators to book in Trinidad. But just the fact that Cambridge allegedly did a service for an entity in Trinidad by monitoring behavior of data subjects in Trinidad. If Trinidad had our similar act, it would bring them under the purview of this act. So if a Cambridge Analytica did that work in Jamaica, and they monitored behavior of data subjects here, they would have to oblige and ensure that they were complying with the standards and obligations under this act. All right, so what are the key obligations of data controllers? One, registration. So you have to register with the Information Commissioner before processing personal data. So that's a pretty huge obligation because, of course, if you don't, there is a fine. Some data controllers will have to appoint appropriately qualified data protection officer. A data protection officer effectively is very similar to an internal auditor. Okay, so what this data protection officer is to do is to ensure that when you've put your governance, your policies in place, they assess it, they ensure and say, okay, we believe it is in keeping with your obligations under the Data Protection Act. In some instances, when you may have a breach or you may have some challenge under the Act, it is the data protection officer who you would first speak to say, listen, this has happened. This is how I've handled it. I think it's fine. And the data protection officer would actually have, in some instances, the right to say, okay, I think that's good. We don't need to now report to Information Commissioner. So that's a very interesting new person that is being included in our landscape. And it really brings home the fact that once you're doing business digitally now, there's this whole other regime, these standards that you need to ensure you put in place. All right, and of course, the analogy with internal audit continues. So on an annual basis, you have to do an impact assessment. And this is an annual report that you as a data controller must submit to the Information Commissioner. The Act, of course, sets out data protection standards. And I will read very quickly from an article. Let me give credit to Professor Graham Greenleaf. He's a professor from the University of university in Australia, UNSW, and he wrote an article in late 2020 on our Data Protection Act. And in conclusion, he says this: Jamaica's Data Protection Act is a remarkably strong post-GDPR data privacy law. Of the nearly 20 features of the EU's GDPR that are relevant to countries outside the EU and are stronger than the 1995 Data Protection Directive, only a handful are missing from explicit inclusion in this law. Data protection by design and default, demonstrable accountability of controllers, etc. The exemptions from the Act may prove to be unreasonably broad, is a view he has. It remains to be seen whether fines of up to 4% of corporate turnover will genuinely be dissuasive when administered by courts, and whether significant compensation awards will be made. Jamaica's law joins in 2019 Barbados law, which it shares many features as a strongly GDPR-influenced law in the Caribbean. However, the US 50,000 limit on fines in Barbados means that Jamaica has a potentially much stronger law. If the data protection authorities of these two jurisdictions actively enforce their laws, data privacy may take on a different meaning in the Caribbean. So, you know, from an academic point of view, our act has received a very strong vote of confidence in what it intends to achieve. And I think that's important to note, because what it does mean is that the regulation is going to be pretty thorough. All right, so can we look quickly at some key data protection standards? So obviously, you must process the data fairly and lawfully. You must process that data, you must obtain the data, beg your pardon, for a specified purpose. So you need to indicate what that purpose is. The data must be accurate and kept up to date. The data must not be kept longer than necessary and must be disposed of in accordance with the regulations. Well, that's what the Act says. We don't yet have the regulations, but I'm sure the regulations will make very clear how you are to dispose of that data. The data must be processed in accordance with the protection standards. Very important. It must be processed with appropriate technical and organizational measures, and transfer of the data outside of Jamaica is prohibited unless adequate levels of protection are used. So you see that the standards to which you are asked to meet are both significant, and they are going to be based on what is considered adequate, what is considered enough. It's not just a matter of you saying, well, you know, we have firewalls on our laptops. We don't store data on laptops. The data is stored just on our central drive in the office, etc. You now have to put in place policies, how you deal with data, how you protect data. You have to look at how you get the data from your customers. You have to get explicit consent, and you have to explain to your customers, to your data subjects, what you're intending to do with their data. All right, so the Act in a number of different sections deals with fines where you do not comply. It deals with offenses which you can fall foul of if you do not do a particular obligation under the Act. And as you heard from Professor Greenleaf, there is a section in our Act which could find a company or body corporate liable to a maximum fine of 4% of its annual gross worldwide turnover for the preceding tax year. So that's pretty significant. And, you know, this is part of why we believe that we need to begin now in educating and in communicating with data controllers, potential data controllers, existing data controllers, as to how you're going to seek to comply with this Act and how you're going to get your IT infrastructure up to date and adequate to deal with the significant challenges you're going to have in complying with the Data Protection Act. All right, so we've looked globally, and we want to just share with you some scenarios that we've seen with the GDPR and other regimes in action, so we can get a sense of what we may see coming once our act goes into force. Okay, in Germany, in 2019, Google was fined 50 million euro for failing to comply with the GDPR's requirements on transparency, adequacy, and consent, relating particularly to certain ad personalization. So I'm sure most of us are familiar. A number of websites you may click on. You subscribe to marketing newsletter from Macy's or whichever company, and they have a number of boxes they ask you to check. Do you agree to share this? Do you agree to share that, etc.? In this particular case, what happened is that the committee that reviewed the complaint found that the consent from those checkboxes was not validly obtained for two reasons. The first, the user's consent was not sufficiently informed. So when they looked at what the user would have read to give their consent, they felt that it was not a sufficient basis that the company should feel comfortable that the customer understood or the user understood the consent they were granting. Second, the user's consent was neither specific nor unambiguous. So, you know, that's a pretty decent fine that you would have to face just from a point of view of not ensuring that you were clear, you were specific and unambiguous in the consent you were asking for and what that consent was being given to do. Okay, so that's very important. The next one is, and we just have a quick comparison so you can see what our act looks like compared to the GDPR. So our act says any informed, specific, unequivocal, freely given expression of will which the data subject agrees to the processing of that data subject's personal data. Okay, and you see the language in the GDPR is really very similar. Any freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous. And we say informed, specific, unequivocal. So the Google example would absolutely obtain here if you're not careful enough to ensure that you do this properly. Our act also says that informed means at the time in question, the data subject is informed about how the personal data will be processed, including the purpose of which the data will be used and the class of persons to whom the personal data may be transferred. Okay, so it will be very important that you put in place good policies, but also that you review your intake documentation, your intake methodology, so that you are gaining the specific consent when you are asking for data subjects data. Right, so the next one was a security breach example, and in December 2020, the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency suffered a major cyber attack. The information stolen from the agency was subsequently published online illegally. Following the attack, the SPA announced we immediately enacted our business continuity arrangements and took immediate action to limit the impact of the cyber attack, notifying relevant authorities, including the Scottish Government, Police Scotland, the National Cyber Security Centre, and the Information Commissioner's Office, with whom we continue to work. This is important because you will understand that if you have any type of cyber attack, any type of breach, you have to report it to the Information Commissioner. Depending on the level of breach, you may also have to report it to other government authorities. We do have a Cyber Crimes Act, most of you are probably aware. So if you can just go to the next slide. Great. So the data controller under our act, section 21(3)(5), the data controller must report to the Information Commissioner any security breach which affects or may affect personal data within 72 hours after having become aware of it, as the case may be. So you have 72 hours within which to report to the Information Commissioner that there has been a breach which affects or may affect personal data. The may affect is important, because you may see a breach that has occurred, and based on your review, you may say, okay, I don't think it's going to affect any of my customers, any of the users. But if the possibility remains that it could affect them, you have that obligation, okay? Of course, it goes without saying that the data controller must also notify each data subject whose personal data is affected by the breach. So this is why you see in other jurisdictions very often where there are cyber attacks or breaches of that nature, the companies put public statements out. Very often, you know, they have, you know, maybe 100,000 up to 1 million customers that may have been affected by such a breach. And it's just more practical for them to publish in various media that they have suffered a breach and they're taking the various steps. Some jurisdictions actually do ask them to make sure they make a public announcement as well. And we may see that in our regulations. And you see that we are mirroring pretty similarly the GDPR regulations there. One of the reasons why this is the case is that if we have obligations under the GDPR, you want to ensure that we are putting those obligations in our national legislation as well. So you don't have to be constantly looking to both regimes to say, okay, how much time under GDPR do I have? How much time under the Data Protection Act? Why? Hotels, for example, a number of you, most of your guests are not, well, I shouldn't say most, but probably over 365 year, more than half of your guests are not Jamaican. So you have to be concerned about how you're complying with GDPR and other legislation. Okay, the next example is technical and organizational measures. So internal structure, policy, methods. In 2019, Bulgaria's Data Protection Authority issued a 5.1 million fine to the country's National Revenue Agency for violations of the GDPR. Their authority, the CPNC, found that the agency failed to implement appropriate technical and organizational measures, resulting in unauthorized access and disclosure of names, PINs, and addresses of Bulgarian citizens, telephones, email addresses, and other personal information. Okay, and then under our act, again, we have the requirement, you must ensure that appropriate technical and organizational measures are implemented against unauthorized processing, accidental loss, destruction, or damage to personal data. The data controller must ensure that its agents and employees who have access to the personal data are aware and comply with these measures. Some of us may have seen the news last week, one of the reports from our Auditor General, which is very interesting. A number of the issues that the Auditor General raised in their report relating to PICA, which is the next slide. So the Auditor General found that our PICA, there were some discrepancies with regards to their technical and organizational measures. PICA failed to manage the risk of unauthorized disclosure and misuse of access rights. They failed to provide confidentiality or non-disclosure agreements on various occasions, and they failed to enforce the agency's password policy in some circumstances. This was actually very insightful and timely because these discrepancies were not found as breaches of the Data Protection Act, but you will see immediately that they all would fall under various sections of the Data Protection Act as standards and obligations that you should meet. So it's a good heads up for PICA and other businesses and agencies that you really need to look at your policies dealing with confidentiality in terms of non-disclosures with your employees, how you deal with password policies, who you give access to personal data, to sensitive data. So in wrapping up, there are a couple of things we'd like to emphasize. One, you want to confirm whether your business needs to comply with the DPA. Second, you want to assess your data processing activities and obligations and how they fall under the DPA. You want to make sure that you have the relevant agreements in place as between you, customer, as between you, your team members, your employees, service providers who may touch and process your data. And so you have to develop proper policies and governance dealing specifically with the data and data protection. You may need to appoint a data protection officer. You will need to know what to do if there is a breach. You need to have internal policies that deal with what do I do in the case of a breach, and you need to put in place the requisite information streams so that the information commissioner hears within 72 hours, but obviously as soon as possible, and any other service providers who may work with you to protect your data, to protect your IT infrastructure, so that you can cauterize that breach as much as possible. A lot of the penalties and fines look at what you do when these things occur. Are your policies strong enough, and how did you act? Okay, so it's really important that you ensure that you act in a timely manner. Okay, thank you. I think we've covered a lot of material, and as I said, what we wanted to do this morning is to give you a pretty substantial introduction to what the regime looks like. I think a question may come: when is the act going to take effect? I can say no, I don't think there is an official date that has been announced. However, I think late last year, the relevant ministry advertised, I think, for over 25 posts of jobs, positions that will be within the Office of the Information Commissioner. I have it on pretty good authority that the physical office is just about ready to be occupied. So I would expect that within this financial year, public sector financial year, we should see the commencement of this act. The act provides a short space of time within which you have a grace period to show full compliance. But I really think that we all have to look now at our infrastructure. We have been pushed, those of us who were slow to join the fourth industrial revolution have been pushed because of COVID, because of work from home. And so it is really important that you get yourselves fully informed as to what you need to do under this act and how you need to treat your data subjects, how you need to treat data that is shared with you, which belongs to the people who share it with you. Just because they give it to you doesn't mean that now you have co-ownership. What it means is you are getting a particular consent to use it in a particular way. And you see that the act specifically says, not only should the consent you request be unequivocal and clear, but you should also indicate how you intend to use the data. So it is really, pretty strong. I want to make a final point on the fact that data subjects, individuals, can seek to get compensation under the act. So in addition to the fines and penalties, there is a specific provision which makes clear that if a data subject has suffered damage because of a breach or contravention of the act, or if a data subject is distressed, which can be emotional distress, because of contravention of the act in terms of how the data has been used, they can bring a civil lawsuit against the data controller to right what they perceive to be that wrong. So it's not just you, having to comply with these standards that an information commissioner will regulate. It's also you dealing with the data of this data subject properly, with respect and with consent. Okay, thank you.
Well, that was a lot, a little frightening, if I might say so, because basically what you're saying, Roderick, is that the information that we're getting on our customers doesn't belong to us.
That's
and
right.
We have to seek permission from them if we're going to use it in any way, shape, or form. And if some unscrupulous person decides to steal that information, or if we use it erroneously in some way, the business owner, operator, IT manager can be held personally liable?
That's actually correct. Yes, the Act does provide for that.
On top of the fact that they're going to get 4% of the worldwide turnover, annual turnover, and is there possible jail term connected to all of this?
There is. I mean, I didn't want to sound like, you know, Captain Doom this morning and go into all of that. But yes, there are significant fines for companies, for the people who actually handle the data. There are breaches and offenses where the specific person, if the company has policies in place, but the person who is charged with the responsibility doesn't handle it properly and doesn't do what they're to do, they can be charged personally. So yes, there are very significant and personal penalties. It's not just a 9 to 5, well, I was at work and, you know, I'm gone home, so the company has to deal with it now. No.
All right. So let us move on to the question and answer. We have quite a few questions here already. I'm going to, I apologize. I should have introduced Dene Richards and Kerry-Ann Kudo, who are members of our team, and they will be posing the questions, verbalizing the questions. Dene, do you have any questions? Can you just start with the first question?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Yes, we have quite a few questions coming in. Our first question, however, comes from Michael. He asks, do data subjects include your employees?
Right, it's a good question. So yes, the answer would be yes. If the data subject provides personal information, personal data to you, then yes, you have an obligation to let them know how you're going to use their data, if you're going to share it. There are exemptions under the Act, and I think that's a good point and place to mention. So if you are processing data in certain circumstances, for the purpose of work, so that would be an example, then while the data is a the data provided by your employee would qualify as a data subject. If you are processing it solely for the purpose of what you have to do internally and you're not sharing it outside, then you have a qualified exemption. But that employee, if there were a breach and they felt that they were affected by that breach, would still have the rights under the DPA.
Okay, Kerry?
We have another question from Candice. Under what circumstances or conditions would a data controller be required to appoint a data protection officer?
Great question. So Section 20, subsection 6 speaks to the data controllers who are currently required to appoint a data protection officer. Public authorities, data controllers who process or intend to process sensitive personal data or data relating to criminal convictions. And quickly, I can tell you, sensitive personal data includes gender, it includes any health issues, matters that you certainly would not be in the ordinary course of business sharing. Data controllers who process personal data on a large scale, or any other data controllers prescribed by the commissioner. So there could be another set of data controllers prescribed by the commissioner who would have to appoint a data protection officer. But currently, public authorities, data controllers who process sensitive personal data or data relating to criminal convictions, and data controllers who process personal data on a large scale.
Okay, moving quickly along, there are two questions from two separate persons, but I'm just going to pose them together. From Christopher, he says, where can I get access to the Data Protection Act? And right. Debbie's asking, does the Act have any teeth?
Right, so I would suggest, if Christopher, if you go to the Parliament website or the Ministry of Science website, you should find the Data Protection Act there that you can download. And I will tell you quickly, Debbie, yes, it has teeth. Let me tell you quickly some of the fines. You have fines of 2 million, you have fines up to 4% of turnover. You have enforcement notices, which the Information Commissioner is able to issue. So let us say that a data subject, a customer of yours, feels that you have misused their data or are unhappy with how you've used their data. They can make a complaint to the Information Commissioner. The Information Commissioner evaluates it and sends an enforcement notice to you, saying you have to provide certain information. If you don't do it within a certain time, you can be fined and found to be in breach of the act. So I would say to you that it does have a lot of teeth. And in preparing for this presentation and coming across Professor Greenleaf's comparison of the Caribbean laws related to data protection, he has said that the Jamaican law is the most rigorous in terms of teeth, because we have gone higher than the Barbados Act, which is a maximum fine of $50,000 US. We have adopted this 4% of gross annual turnover. So let's say, for whatever reason, someone in Jamaica decided to complain that Amazon had used their data in a particular way. And let's use quickly the example of Cambridge Analytica, Facebook. So for whatever reason, Amazon has your data and they sell the data set for their customers in Jamaica to someone else, and you start to be bombarded with messaging about your health. So let's say for whatever reason, Amazon is able to, with their data, determine that you have a particular health need, maybe based on your shopping preference and other information you provide. If in fact, you have a complaint about that and our Information Commissioner finds that Amazon was at fault, they could face a fine up to 4% of their gross annual global turnover. So I would say that that is a lot of tea.
Okay, the numbers of questions are racking up, and we're quickly running out of time for this segment. But the good thing about it is that at the very end of all three presentations, we will be going back to these questions. So you know, just hang in there. The questions will get answered. We'll be staying here until all of those questions are answered. Let me just take one or two final questions for you, Roderick, before we go to that. Let me see here. So one says, is the Information Commissioner above the Jamaica Constabulary Force? Yes.
No, obviously the Jamaica Constabulary Force under the ambit of national security would have clear exemptions and deal with a whole different level of access to information. So that is data privacy and national security, okay? The Information Commissioner, however, think of the Information Commissioner as on the civil side regulating how you deal with data. All right, so I would not say it's above the JCF, but under the purview of this act, we'll have significant powers.
Okay, and
enforcement.
One thing, so Amishka says, so each time I decide to change the purpose or intent of the data, I must seek consent from the data subject?
Yes.
Good. All right. Nothing clearer than that.
Yes.
Michael Sutherland, I'm not sure if this is a question for you or if maybe we should hold this for the tech guys, but how does cloud storage affect compliance with the DPA? Right,
good question. So you have to quickly suggest the answer. It's not an absolute answer, Michael, because obviously there are a number of variables as to cloud storage, where, etc. But what you would be obliged to do is to ensure that wherever your cloud storage ends up, wherever your pot is at the end of your rainbow, that the regime in terms of protecting the data, in terms of processing the data, is in keeping with our DPA. So you do have an obligation to ensure that if you do use cloud storage, there is compliance with the standards under our DPA.
And also he wants Odeon wants you to repeat the entity, which entity the breach should be reported to.
Information Commissioner. In some instances, if you do have a data protection officer, you would first report it to the data protection officer.
Okay. I think we are pretty much out of time for this section. We have quite a few more questions there, but we will certainly get back to you. I do want to move on to the next presentation. Thank you so very much, Roderick.
You're welcome.
What would we do without you? Thank you.
Sure, most welcome.
All right, so we're moving on to the next presentation, and it's by Info Exchange Limited, my company, or the company that I represent. Info Exchange is a leading IT consulting and services firm. We are proud to announce that this year, Info Exchange is celebrating 25 years of operations, serving both the private and the public sector. And our goal is to help our clients improve their operational efficiencies and to shore up their security posture, so that their company is able to respond quickly and safely to changes that are happening in the market. And you know that today with COVID is a great example of how things are changing very, very quickly, and companies have been challenged as to how they can now adjust accordingly. And of course, with the ultimate goal of them achieving exponential growth. Our next speaker, David Allen, is the co-founder. He's at the helm of this organization. He's a co-founder and the CEO. He has over 3 decades of experience within the IT field. And over the last quarter century, it feels good to say that, he has grown Info Exchange to be a leader in software-defined infrastructures such as HCI and SD-WAN, and of course, the work from anywhere operations. I know he has a lot to say, so I'm not going to talk anymore. I'm handing it over to David. Over to you.
Okay, thanks, Anne-Marie. Thanks for that. And Roderick, thanks to our great opening batting, you score enough boundary. So,
thank you, David. Thank you.
I'm going to try to rack up some more runs for the team. We've been saying for a long time that company boards and C-suites need to rethink their present environment, certainly in relation to the value of the information in their care, as well as the potential risk that it carries. So I'm really very encouraged today to see the number of participants that have come in from business leadership. But to really address this issue of data privacy and security, one really needs to start by understanding the nature of the problem and how we got here. Because a lot of these things that we've been talking about and Roderick's been talking about almost seem intuitive. But you see, what's been happening is that a process has been going on over the past few decades, and oddly, we may not have noticed it. So I want you to look around the room right now, at your home or at your office, and compare that in your mind with what you had back in the 80s or the 90s. Now, I want you to take particular notice of what's missing. Stuff like Rolodexes, address books, road maps, answering machines, VHS tapes, CDs, DVDs, and lots more. What's happened is that these things have been replaced by, a smartphone, an app on a smartphone. What's happened is that digital has dematerialized the world, and these things that people need really are no longer dependent on the physical items. So their needs are completely satisfied by this digital representation. So this actually is what's driving this thing you keep hearing about, digital transformation. So data is now becoming the thing of value. So, okay, fine. What does that have to do with data privacy? Well, guess what? Digital has also dematerialized us people. So what's now is that we are now represented by a collection of individual pieces of data. This is what we call PII, or personally identifiable information. Now, not to get too philosophical this morning, but consider that, all of you have a physical self, this touchy-feely stuff, but also a digital self. And if you think about it, there should really only be one version of each. And both are vulnerable to, attack and damage and compromise, which, the results, of course, can be quite devastating. But then some people say, well, so what? Well, guess what? This digital town square is where all of the action is taking place today. Business transactions, social interaction. So it's really not practical to believe that you can just stay out of it. The problem we have, and I think this is really the crux of the matter, is that common sense ethical practices that govern our privacy in the physical world have really not translated or been transferred into digital. So personal privacy, it really has taken on a new shape in the digital space. And that's because you're not moving this physical material around in space anymore, but rather manipulating bits and bytes, which now compose a person. In other words, privacy can more be easily bypassed because you don't even think about it. So let's just drive this home. So I'm gonna just go through a little thought experiment with everybody. Consider this. No, please don't put the poll up. So, please consider this. Your house, say, is in a neighborhood experiencing a serious uptick in crime, right? Lots of break-ins happening, muggings going on down the road. But you've been safe, but you realize that you need to improve your security because you have lots of valuable stuff in your house. So you start by installing bars on the windows, but you figure that you can wait to bar up the doors until you get some more money, down the track. So life goes on. Then you have some family from country come to live with you, right? And they bring with them all of their possessions. Everything is fine until one day, you're away, there's a break-in. And the entry came through some unused window around the back that you didn't remember you had. All of your possessions are stolen. All your auntie possessions are stolen. And what's worse is they get mugged and kidnapped and held for ransom. Your aunt had the assumption of safety when she came to stay with you. And as an owner of your household, it is your responsibility and not anybody else in your employment to make sure that you have done everything to protect her. So this, thought experiment really is an analog for what's happening with data and why security and privacy really is a matter to be driven by business leadership. When somebody messes with your, the data in your care, you should really have the same visceral response as if somebody put their hand in your pocket and took your wallet. So today, what we want to be going through are, some of the risks we are facing, some of my thoughts on why companies seem to still remain vulnerable to attack, and then of course, finally, what you can do about that. So, okay, with that fresh in our minds, Dene, can you just put up the poll question again for me, please? Is that possible? Yes. It's a simple little question. Don't take no time to answer it, please. Data privacy, is it the same? Data privacy and data security, are they the same things? Yes, no, don't know. Just click. I'll give you another few seconds to do so. Easy choices. All right. All right. So Dene, can you go ahead and close the poll and then let's see what we, okay, good. So this is really showing that, you guys have been really paying attention to what Roderick was saying. And Brian, can you go to the next slide? Yeah. Really what this is about is, I guess the short answer, which most of you got, is no. Data privacy is not the same thing. And what we try to do is sort of represent it as a Venn diagram here. But they're very much related, which is why some people think that, yeah, they're the same. Data privacy is around protecting data, and it's achieved by focusing on three main things, right? Confidentiality, ensuring confidentiality. That means no unauthorized persons can access the data. Only authorized persons can access your data. Integrity. This means that there are no unauthorized changes. And if there are authorized changes, only authorized persons can do so. And integrity now also means that there's no loss or corruption of the data either. And finally, availability. And this is really where we talk about a resilient infrastructure, that's resistant to failure. So your data is always available when it's needed. And if there ever is a disruption, then it's recoverable in the shortest possible time. So, okay, so that's the data side, and it's really driven by technology. Well, consider this. If you have authorized access to my personal data, does that mean that you can do anything you want with it? No, right? That's where the privacy part kicks in. So privacy is around protecting the rights of the individual, to their personal information. These are going to be things that are business obligations to abide by the rights of the individual and their right to be able to access and determine what you do with their data. These are types of things really that are defined by policies in the business and procedures in the business, which Roderick alluded to, that the Act is saying that you need to have these in place. So, but also you'll see where they overlap is really where data or technology and the policies come together. And I don't want to spend long on this, but really it's things like retention. How long do you need to keep the data? That's defined by some policy, but really it's some technology that enables you to determine and live up to that policy or that decision. Similarly with remediation, being able to recover that data in the event of a breach. So what I'm going to ask, can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so what this is showing here is in order for you to even have a ghost of a chance of complying with those things that we've been speaking of so far, is that you really need to take an inventory of the data you have. So there are going to be some questions that you need to be asking from a management level to your various department heads. And the results of these questions that you can see here will greatly inform you as to the risk the company is carrying. And such an exercise is absolutely necessary in order for you to respond to a simple data subject request, which is like, tell me what data you have on me and how long you have it and why do you have it? So, questions like asking your department heads, what data do we hold? Whose data do we hold? Why are we holding it? Where can I find it? How are we protecting it? And so on, must be asked and answered. And what you're seeing here now is the actual scope and complexity of the matter. And that's just on the privacy side. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is really kind of stress you out and start to look at some of the risks on the security side. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, what this is showing you are the global costs of cybercrime, including things like damages and destruction of data, stolen money, lost productivity, theft of intellectual property, theft of personal and financial data, embezzlement, fraud, the cost of forensic investigations, restoration and deletion of hacked data, restoration of systems, plus a reputational harm that's done to the brand. And you can see that the frequency seems to be, increasing, and the severity seems to be increasing from a low of 3 trillion in 2015, and it's doubled here in 2021. And if you looked at it in terms of the wealthiest economies in terms of GDP, it will be the third richest economy above Japan. And look at where it's going, or projected to grow till 2025, 10 trillion. What's happening is that the criminal organizations are coming together to do this. It is literally the greatest transfer of wealth from one set of individuals to others. Can you go to the next slide? So, this is something that it's all in the media here now. You hear a lot of, and it's ransomware. It's a particular type of extortion done by criminals. Basically, it's a digital mugging, where they use some mechanism, to deliver malware. Think of malware like the gun or the knife, because this is the thing that inflicts the damage or the harm to the business. So ransomware is extremely popular. Why? Because it offers the criminal the least risk for the greatest gain, the biggest payoff. Obviously, in the physical world, a physical mugging, the guy has a greater chance of getting caught or even hurt. Whereas in the digital space, you can't see him or you can't find him. What you'll see from this is that the frequency of the attacks are increasing from one every 2 minutes. This is worldwide in 2015, and you see here now in 2021, every 11 seconds. What's also notable is the costs are increasing, or the severity is also increasing. Or, in 2015, 325 million, and it's over 20 billion in 21. And look at where it's going in in 10 years' time. Okay. So how is all of this really happening? What happens is that because ransomware has such a big payoff for little risk, what the bad guys are doing are effectively creating these marketplaces where ransomware, where malware is created, and a ransomware campaign around that malware is also created. And you can go to the marketplace, if you're a bad guy, check it out, and run your campaign, release your campaign on the world. And the proceeds of your evil deeds are also facilitated within the marketplace. Whether it be selling of goods that you've stolen, and by the way, credit cards on the dark web are only carrying a value of less than $1 now. But the things such as personal data, the medical records, things like that are carrying much higher and higher value. Credit cards, what happens is that the banks are doing a pretty good job on stopping that fraud. So it's having less and less value. Plus the medical records is what we call rich data. It's much harder to recover that kind of thing. So there's a much higher value in the black market. So really what you have happening now is this thing we call ransomware as a service. The same things that we've been using in the regular world with as a service, as a means of lowering your upfront cost and lowering the need of particular expertise in order to get the gain of the thing, is being used by the bad guys. Same concept. And that's one of the reasons why you're seeing this accelerating. One of the things I'd like you guys to take away is that you can't hide. It is very, very reasonable to assume that this will happen. If it's not already happened to you, it is happening here in Jamaica. It's just that it's not being reported, and we'll get to that in a second. Can you go to the next slide, please? So what I wanted to show here is some of the vulnerabilities that organizations have in terms of ransomware. This was a survey done by a number of MIS, to a number of MIS managers over a few thousand companies. And what they're saying that the entry point for the delivery of this malware is via spam and phishing emails. We kind of know this, right? Basically, any of these touch points that the end user to the internet is what they go after. So, spam and phishing emails are primary, and I'll talk a little bit later on this. The next thing too is, poor user practices, gullibility we call it, and it's people take shortcuts in making decisions, and often that leads to poor decisions. So there is a general lack of adequate security training within the organizations. And then some of the other ones that you see there, weak passwords, open RDP, remote desktop protocols, through the networks, believe it or not, they're still there. That thing that we call clickbait, those are those things, I'm sure you've seen it on social media, where you are enticed by some sensational story, some giveaway that you hear about. You're enticed to click so that malware can be delivered to you. So these are some of the things that that the bad guys, some of the methods that the bad guys are using to get at you. Thanks. I can go to the next slide. So why are we vulnerable? We know these things, but why are we vulnerable? The attacks from these guys are relentless. Everybody has antivirus or some other protection in place, but the data is showing that there is still great success by these criminals. So something else is happening. Something else is being overlooked. And, so what are they? So next slide there, right? All right, so I bet no one thought I would put this up as one of the vulnerabilities. But in our experience, what we have found is that there's a lagging awareness that cybercrime is an existential threat that can end you. And one of the things as well is that the level of board sponsorship is lacking. The board, or from the senior most levels, that's what will drive the operational changes necessary to a security and a privacy by design culture throughout the organization. The other things too is that there seems to be an inadequate amount of funding and resources. One of the things to understand is that security is a different skill set from your IT infrastructure manager, and security practitioners are in very scarce and in a very high demand here now. So there has to be some amount of talent management that's going on to bring in the requisite skills into the organization, and of course the requisite funding for security initiatives. All of this we've found is leading to the sort of triage approach to security, where the security officers have to make some choices as to what's most priority now. We believe that is an inadequate approach, because it's not a fact that you plug that hole when there's another hole over there and the boat is sinking. So let's just use back to our home metaphor that we used earlier. You have 10 windows in your house. You can get enough funds to secure 3, and you'll do the other ones next year. Are you safe? Are you satisfied with that approach? I don't think that's adequate. Next slide, please. One of the other things that has really changed and has made us even more vulnerable is that there have been some new ways in which we operate now. And what has been happening is that we are still using some old approaches to, to secure us in this new paradigm. And one of the things, of course, is this work from home. And work from home, thanks to COVID, it was really a disruptive event. And many companies and their security teams had to go and make some changes almost overnight. Not that we haven't been saying these things for the longest time, but things happen and then you're forced to do something. And what happened is that it has changed and opened up the security and the attack surface of the company. What this little diagram is showing you is what once was the castle, where all of your jewels and your staff lived and operated, was surrounded by a moat, a firewall that kept the bad guys out and the good guys in. The thing is now, as we mentioned earlier, is that the network, the internet, is now your corporate network. I'm at home. I'm accessing applications in the cloud. I'm accessing my applications on premises within the organization, but using the internet to get in. So what this is meaning is that your good guys have left the building and they're dwelling among the bad guys, or should I say bad guys are dwelling among you, and you can't tell who is who. You'll see that one of the things that we're using to gain access to the office is this thing called VPN. I don't want to beat up on VPN too much, but what it is, it's your front door. And all you're saying to everybody, here's my front door, knock, and let me ask you who you are, and if you pass, then I'll let you in. The thing is that the issues here is that even if you have the proper credentials, you could be on a compromised endpoint, which will carry the compromised laptop, which will carry the infection into the organization. You need to move to a different approach for that, and a different concept for that, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the key thing is that we are still using an older approach for a paradigm that has changed. You can go to the next slide. So this is about these large attack surfaces that we have. There are many more devices that we as individuals have. I have 5 devices, laptop, tablet, phone, extra phone, all of these things, and all of them are connected. All of them can connect to the network. Any one of them can get compromised. So it's about, do you even know what you have connected to your network? So we really need to start to consider things completely differently. The other thing too is this thing of zero-day attacks. The zero-day really is about, this is something new I've never seen before, so I don't know, I don't recognize the pattern, and hence it defeats my defenses. There's an approach that you need to take with these zero-day attacks, which really is to utilize some type of sandbox. For any traffic coming into the organization is detonated in the sandbox outside. And there are other methods as well that we don't need to talk about here. We'll talk about later in more detail. The other thing too, guys, is this thing about every company I've ever worked for had a fire drill or earthquake drill, a rally point set up outside where everybody goes to in case there's some event, disruptive event that happens. How many of you have a security incident action plan? And note that, as Roderick had mentioned, you have a 72-hour window to report an incident. So that is not the time to go figure out what to do. You need to have a plan in place. All right, so can you go to the next slide? Okay, so, everybody should be feeling a little uncomfortable right now. So I want you to just take a breath. Your best fighting chance is to have a plan, a framework, a methodology backed by some solid products and services, in order to address these vulnerabilities. So the the good news really is that I'm going to show you that right now. Okay, so go to the next slide, Rob, please. All right. So this is a framework that we recommend that everybody uses. I'm going to go through it in a minute. But for it to work, it's assumed that you address the first vulnerability that I mentioned earlier. Leadership culture, the C-suite need to be involved. It's pivotal to the success of this. Unfortunately, I can't help you with that, but I'm assuming you'll get that sorted. Again, the first thing to recognize or remember is that the cyber criminal attacks are relentless. They will keep coming at you again and again because they're trying to find some new blind spot that you never knew you had. So the top of the framework is what we talk about in like preventing things, bad things from happening. And that means by, first of all, predicting, where the next attack is going to come from. That means understanding your vulnerabilities, right? Having an asset inventory, both in terms of data and non-data assets. Okay, we spoke to that earlier about those questions of where is my data, what is my data, and to prepare some type of baselines of what I have. So I know when I add something new, I know what the new baseline is. But it's very important that you keep looking where are these vulnerabilities, because those are the most likely avenues of attack. Then you need to move now to the prevent side, which is about hardening what you have and plugging those holes that you've identified, being able to isolate your operations into segments so that which limits the blast radius in the event that there is some intrusion. And of course, as I mentioned, you need to be able to reduce that attack surface, lessen the places and the points where they can come in on you. Good. So the next thing now on the bottom line is about, okay, the getting, okay, what you're going to do now. So the next part now, starting from the right, detecting, you have to be able to detect when there has been a breach. You need to contain it. That's the containing that blast radius again, and prioritize what you're going to remediate first. Okay. And then as you move across now, responding is, investigating how that breach occurred and how to remediate, and then to design in a change, which will then plug the hole that they obviously took advantage of. So in the middle, you see this thing that we talk about, continuous monitoring and assessment. Continuously looking for where that next vulnerability is, learning from what you have done and taking appropriate actions to inform the other parts of the network. So again, I'm hoping this is demonstrating the scope of the issues and why C-level attention really is necessary to drive these operational changes that really have to be backed by some good solutions. What I'm going to ask, can you just move to the next slide? Okay, so that's the framework. What I'm showing you here, and this is my last slide, what I'm showing you here are 8 of the key areas that if you address these areas, you have the best fighting chance to stave off an attack from the outside. And really, it's again around securing the user and the data wherever it may be. Now, one of the first ones is you see there about securing email. As you saw, spam and phishing mails are the primary tool that the bad guys use to deliver their malware. And typically that's done, you get an email, it looks like a legitimate mail, but it has some link in it, which is weaponized. They do some very tricky things where they will send up the mail in and the link is, points to a benign site. And then 10 minutes later, after they've sent the mails out, they make a change to the site or change to the URL so that it now points to a malicious site. And what that does, it typically defeats, your primary firewall or your mail filtering, because it sees the initial mail as benign. So you need something to deal with that. And typically that's done by rewriting the URLs. And those are technical details that we can talk about at another time. Next, you need to secure that internet. This is a primary means by which data flows into and out of the organization through the user. So, and as of course, the corporate network is now the internet. Both inbound and outbound traffic really must be secured. So, and no, guys, antivirus and personal firewalls may not be the sufficient. They are easily bypassed by these more advanced techniques. So really what you need to be doing is looking at the specific traffic as it goes in and out of the organization. We talk on that some more. Then there's this thing that we call the remote access. Now, I said before, you really need to look at ditching the VPN, because it's a 30-year-old approach to a problem that has fundamentally changed. We would use VPN to access our office's network from elsewhere on a periodic basis. I'm traveling, I need to get at some files or some stuff on my network, and I need to connect and stay there for maybe an hour, couple of hours, periodically. What's happened is, because of work from home, we now have most or a large fraction of our staff outside of the network, and they are making these permanent connections all day long through the front door. And what we're saying is that the bad guys know is a access point, and they're hammering that front door to find a way in. What you really need to be doing and thinking about is going to a zero trust. I trust nothing but verify. Everything goes dark so that the bad guys can't attack what they can't see. Then now, the next thing, of course, as I'd mentioned earlier in the framework, is that looking at that continuous monitoring and patch management. The malware, once it's introduced into the organization, it takes advantage of some vulnerability that's existing on your network. And what we found, especially look at things like WannaCry, that one, which was I think was a $4 billion in damages around the world. That what it was taking advantage of a vulnerability for which a patch was released many months earlier and was left undone for whatever reason within the organizations. So bad guys are looking to exploit vulnerabilities. So patching your operations is vital. Next, of course, as I said, it's the user who they're targeting and their behavior. And as I said, I mean, we're busy, and they are trying to take advantage of the overworked and busy guy just as much as the nonchalant and gullible ones. But it's because it's human nature to take shortcuts when making decisions, and that leads to poor decisions. So training, ongoing training of staff, not only new recruits, but the guys that have been there all along, has to be done. And this is what's building that security culture in the organization. Resilient operations, that speaks to the fact that as part of the requirements for data security is that my operations must be available. So really is talking to, your data centers, your networks, and so on, that they're always available in the event of a disruption. You can continue operations, and that the data is recoverable. You need to show these things as things that you're doing in the organization. The next point I will talk to is, of course, endpoint protection and data loss prevention. What this is really speaking to is the fact that the endpoint, laptop, what your mobile phone, what your end users are using to conduct their work, to perform their work, that can be compromised. And without an endpoint for them to do their work, they're down. And plus, this is a vector for bringing malware into the organization. So you need to be finding ways to be able to restore that endpoint back to its last known good operation. And also, these also are the points where data can be exfiltrated. And you need to be able to identify and prevent that from happening. And hence the data loss prevention. And finally, there is this thing that we call privileged access management. Malware, once introduced into your network, needs to escalate its privilege in order to do and perform its evil deeds, right? So the idea now is that privileged access management must be able to manage privilege and limit it by context and only provide it when it is needed. And these are some of the things that we also recommend to our customers. Now, again, guys, there's just far too much to cover in all of this, and which is why I'm gonna take this opportunity to just mention that we will be conducting a series of seminars separate to this one, where we're gonna take a deeper dive into each of these areas and to investigate and show you how these solutions work. Can you just go to the next slide there, Brian? Yeah. So I know I'm just encouraging you to go right now, to infoexchangeja.com and register for the internet access and secure private access. Sorry, I heard somebody. So internet access and secure private access seminar, which is on our Zscaler or in the local vernacular Zscaler product and service. And this is going to be talking about how to be securing your internet. Remember, the internet is now your corporate network. It's a given, can't run away from that. And then how to secure, that work from home. So October 13, guys, go ahead and register now. It's another free event. I will, for sake of time, just pause it there. Anne-Marie and team, thank you very much. Hope I scared people enough.
No, yes, it really is overwhelming, the amount of information that we need to process in order to ensure that we are ready and protected. I believe that one of our panelists has a comment. Rob Davis, I think. Rob?
Yeah, I'm here. Okay. I'm supposed to introduce myself, right?
That's right.
I'm Robert Davis. Yeah, I'm Robert Davis. I'm a director both of Info Exchange and Fraser, Fontaine and Com. David, I have most people, when they hear about ransomware and so forth, the question that always comes certainly to me is that, but I have my backups already. If someone encrypts my data, my live data, I have my backups. Why? Please tell me a little bit more about that. Why is it that that's not a solution?
Yeah, you notice that backups are getting hit. They're actually connected to the primary data source, yeah. And there's some mechanism that you have in place to automate the backups, right? And so the malware follows that path and hits the backup. In fact, if you remember Maersk, the shipping line, they got hit by a ransomware attack, and it took down their entire network worldwide, with the exception of one, which just happened to be having a power cut. And that's what protected them. The malware couldn't get to that network. So what it does, it follows the path. I don't know if if that's sufficient for you, or if you want more technical dive into it, in which case we could ask our esteemed CIO to chime in on that. I don't know if he's...
Mondel, do you want to add anything more to that?
Well, we could add that it is important that you consider that if you have a backup, then that backup needs to be immutable, meaning that you need to back up to a place where that data cannot be changed. Because most of our backups today, we're either backing up to secondary storage, which is easily accessible, as David said, or we're backing up to some external source, which is also connected. So once they have credentials for on-premise, you find that most persons use the same credentials off-premise, or the credentials are stored or connected to the on-premise credentials, and hence they have easy access to it. And because of that, they can also encrypt the external store. So what you want is to make sure that when you're doing backups, you're doing at least one of your backups is to storage that is immutable, meaning that cannot be changed, cannot be altered, and therefore ransomware can't affect it.
Okay.
Can that be automated? That's my final question.
Yes, that can be automated, and we have solutions for that.
Okay, wonderful. Let's just keep these panelists up. There is another question here. We kind of answered it a little bit, but let's just go into it. Are you saying that VPN, this is coming from Ryan, are you saying that VPN connections are no longer safe? And if yes, what is the modern solution?
I'll take that one down.
We won't go as far as saying that VPN connections are not safe. What we will say is that there are better methods of actually providing remote access. So if you look back at 2020 and you just scan the news, do a search in Google, you will find that VPN was one of the major sources of actually breaches and avenues for breach. Colonial Pipeline, VPN credentials compromised. So you really have to look at, do you still want to put users on the network, or do you want to, or is your intention to connect those users to their applications? And really and truly, when you look at it, it's really about connecting users to applications and not to the network. And therefore, if it's connecting users to the applications, then why do they need to be actually on the network if you can connect them to the applications without them being on the network? So there are now more advanced means of actually doing that. And that is why David spoke about secure remote access using a zero trust network access framework. And basically what that is to say, here what? I'm not going to trust. I'm always going to verify, meaning that you have to identify yourself. And not only that, I'm going to connect you only to the resources that you need access to. I'm not going to connect it to the network, only to the applications that you need access to. And I'm going to do so in a way that you're no longer on the network. And hence, if something is happening at home, at the coffee shop, on your endpoint, that means what I have done is to limit what the bad guy has access to. And that's it. As simple as that.
I'm going to recommend to Ryan that he signs up for that deep dive session. Yes, that's specifically one of the areas that will be covered. And final question, and I'm going to throw this over to Rob because you are operating at a very senior level, so you're probably the best person to answer this. Debbie is asking, how can we sell to the leadership culture of small organizations who believe they have had no incident, so everything is okay? And in-house IT can manage with basic protect wares? That's a very good question, which we hear quite often.
All right. Well, my favorite saying is the only thing worse than bad news is bad news late. All right. So, everybody, when you look at the places that have been hacked, you're looking at, massive companies, banks within Jamaica, Amazon, Google. All of these people thought that they were protected. They didn't think that they were exposed. They thought they were protected. And one of the things now is that It's not a matter of if. Roderick said it actually. It's not a matter of if, but when, right? And you need to do everything you can do to protect yourself. So you're living in a time where things are changing, and the actual things that you have in place and you're depending upon and you're comfortable about are no longer, should no longer be taken as a source of comfort. You need to change with the time because the threat itself is changing, and it does have to be from the top. A company's culture always comes from the top, from the board of directors or the managing director or the general manager, if that's the person who runs things day to day. So that it has to come from the top, and the top needs to recognize that there's an issue and they need to address it. And specifically to your question of someone who has a company that has never been hacked, the fact that you've never been hacked yesterday doesn't mean that you won't be hacked today or tomorrow by a new threat.
Yeah, it is regrettable that often you have to be, hurt before you make that move. I can only say that, does a continuous knocking on that door sometimes is what is required. Just continuous education. Sometimes it's those below that have to educate those above.
I would, if you mind, I would just also say to that person is just refer to them that, there's a ransomware attack every 11 seconds. And that has changed from every 2 minutes a few years ago. And it's just increasing and increasing, or should I say getting smaller and smaller. At the time it was getting smaller and smaller. So it's literally, you've been lucky. And consider that it's a existential threat. You're done. So are they willing to take that risk for the cost of, a fraction of what it would cost in losing a business? Plain and simple.
Okay.
Just to make another point, Anne-Marie, just quickly, I think that, sometimes you see these very big figures for ransomware. I mean, Colonial Pipeline paid out $5 million for ransomware. JBS paid out $11 million. And you say, wow, that's a lot of money. But consider that those companies went through some decision-making process to actually pay that ransom, because the cost of the actual breach is actually much larger than the ransomware that was paid. And for the board of directors and the C-suite needs to understand that while the IT officers and the security officers are responsible, the board of directors and the C-suite are accountable. And at the end of the day, if something happens to the business where brand is damaged or you can't serve your customers, you're ultimately accountable. And therefore, it is definitely your duty to be interested in it and make sure that it is well funded.
All right, time is really up on top of us, but I do want to get to these last two questions. Michael is asking this question again. I suspect he didn't get the correct answer or adequate answer. He is asking, what is the advice for companies whose primary data are held in cloud SaaS and accessible from anywhere? And also, do you perform, Robert is asking, do you perform penetration tests? So Ondel, can I ask you to just answer Michael's, what's the advice for companies whose primary data are held in cloud SaaS and available from anywhere?
Okay, so when it comes to data privacy, that's an issue that you'll have to speak to your legal team about. But in short, if you're using cloud storage, you'd want it to be in a jurisdiction that is compatible to that of Jamaica when the act comes into force. And you'd have to figure out, am I storing personal information in that cloud storage, or it's not personal information? If it's not, then it does not fall under the act. In terms of just general security, if you're using cloud storage, then you need to make sure that only authorized accounts have access to it, and that it is not open to the public. I think we have seen lately certain breaches where it is actually open to the public, and therefore hackers were able to get to a portion of data because it was open to the public. So I would say in short, make sure that only authorized users have access to your cloud storage. And when the act comes into play, you'd have to figure out whether or not data sovereignty issues come into play as to where it needs to be stored or where it can't be stored. And then for the other question, Anne-Marie, you said that the other question was about
performing penetration tests.
Performing penetration tests. Now,
do we do that?
Well, let us look at it this way. There are two things that you need to consider. One is, can someone get in? That's one question. But when you look at it, that is only one aspect of how the ransomware and the bad guys are actually entering your premises. If you notice, they're sending a spam or phishing email. Did they try and forcefully come in? No, they didn't. No. They're actually, on the web pages of CNN and BBC, and they're setting certain traps for you. And when you click on those ads, did they try and bore in? So therefore, we have to be very careful that we don't subscribe to saying, well, we're going to be doing penetration testing, and as long as we feel comfortable that they can't penetrate, then I can't be compromised. That is not true, because the bad guys have evolved beyond just trying to brute force their way in. Penetration testing is important, but only to the point where you're reducing your attack surface.
I have two points I want to add.
I'm sorry. I do want to interrupt you. I'm so sorry, David, but we are really, really running behind, and we do have to get to the next presentation. Hold that thought. Hold that thought. I want to thank you, gentlemen, for jumping in. Thank you, David, for your insightful presentation. We are going to have to move on to the next presentation. We now know what our responsibilities are in terms of the DPA and how to protect our customers' data. We've discussed the issues related to security and steps on how to ensure our data is protected and the information, our customers' private information is protected. So now we want to know, in life there's no surety what to do in case all else fails. How do we recover? How do we move on from there? And we're going to move on to cyber insurance. Now, Fraser, Fontaine and Kong is a household name and really requires no, no introduction. We've probably all done business with them in some way, shape or form over the years. And, and it's been quite a while, because I gather they are celebrating their 50th anniversary this year. Congratulations to them. They must be doing something right. Now, Fraser, Fontaine and Kong, FFK, has partnered with Beazley Insurance Group to bring cyber insurance to Jamaica. We're very excited about it. So it's with a pleasure that I introduce our final presenter, Mr. Najib Bousakr. I'm so sorry.
That's correct. That's correct.
Bousakr, right. Mr. Bousakr is the regional head of Latin America and the Caribbean for the Beazley Insurance Group. Najib has 2 decades of experience in insurance with a focus on cyber, crime, and directors and officers insurance. He has made his mark across the world, having worked in leading insurance companies in the UK and Brazil, eventually joining the Beazley Insurance Group in 2017. And for those of you who don't know, Beazley is one of the leading syndicates in Lloyds. That's the largest and oldest insurance market in the world. So we definitely have a cyber insurance expert amongst us this morning. And we're very happy to have him here. Najib, I'm just going to hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. Thank you, everyone, for being present. So without further ado, let's discuss the cyber risk from an insurance perspective. So for the next half an hour or so, I would like to give you an overview of the ever-changing world of cyber risk and how we insurers are adapting to face this risk, all whilst continuing to provide you with the best insurance solutions. Next slide. I don't know so a little bit about Beazley. So we were established in 1982 as a Lloyds syndicate, as Anne-Marie said. We have since grown to become an insurance company. We have expanded the clients base that we serve and our geographic reach. We are now a mature insurance business with a well-diversified portfolio. That being said, more than 60% of our revenue come from cyber and executive risk business. So unlike other insurance companies, we're very much focused on cyber, and we make it part of our strategy. The US was the predominant market for us up until recently, but since 2017, we have opened office in Singapore, in Barcelona, Paris, and in Miami to serve the Latin America and the Caribbean market. Next slide. So Beazley, the cyber team at Beazley has been around since 2009. We were one of the first cyber markets. We had tremendous growth since the beginning, obviously, with all, with cyber becoming such a topical issue. We have teams all over the US and outside the US, and we are the pioneers in what we call breach response. So going back to 2009, our clients had access to vendors under their policies, but they needed to help. They needed help to coordinate their response. So this is where Beazley breach response came in. We have ample experience on large, medium, and small risks. And from our perspective, suffering a cyber incident isn't really a disaster, but mishandling it is. So we'd really like to be there from the beginning, from the moment the breach occurs. We spent more than 80% of our claims spent on services and managing incidents. And we have managed, since 2012, we have managed 6 out of the top 10 incidents in the world, the largest incidents. And we have a database of 16,000 global breach incidents globally. Next slide. So this is our partnership with Fraser, Fontaine, and Kong. I think, Anne-Marie, you touched on that. We can continue to the following slide. So cyber risk is on the rise, as we've seen from the 2 previous presentations, both frequency and impact. The threat is varied and adaptable. Hackers and criminals always end up adapting to new protection and security measures implemented and always find ways to overcome it. And the acceleration of the digital transformation with the pandemic has, the increase of home working, the whole boom of cryptocurrency, the fintechs, the competing with traditional banks, all of these contribute to a high web traffic, which means high risk of data breach or intrusion. I think this file is quite representative of the impact that the GDPR had since its implementation. So this is an example in the United Kingdom. So the fines used to range between the 100,000 and 500,000 British pounds before GDPR. And since implementation of GDPR, we've seen fines in the millions. In this case, I used the most extreme one, which is British Airways, which was 183 million pounds in fine. Next slide. So next one, please. So why is cyber insurance needed? I think that's probably the first question you would ask. We discussed earlier that there is an issue with employee negligence. So employees tend to be very negligent, especially when there's a lack of awareness and lack of training of employees. There's also a risk from the own company's negligence. So when they forgot to encrypt, when they don't have a corporate security officer. There's also malicious acts such as fraud and theft, disenfranchised employees. And then there are the external risks. So for example, the hackers looking to introduce a malicious software or disrupting the company's services, the phishing, which we've heard of so often these days, fraudulent practice of sending emails purporting to be from a reputable company in order to induce individuals to reveal personal information and confidential information. There's also the social engineering element, which is the use of deception to manipulate individuals into disclosing confidential information. And there's also another element which we often forget about, which is the lack of security at the providers and the commercial partners that you're dealing with, which could affect your own security and cause breach within your systems. I think we can go through this slide. We can skip through the slide. I'm conscious of time. So costs incurred by a cyber event. So, you know, the pecuniary loss of a customer affected by the breach. So question you ask yourself is, how many losses will this customer suffer? What's the impact of the data breach on your own customer? The loss to the assured, to yourself as a company, so your notification costs, the lawsuits you have to pay, the audits you have to go through, the reputation costs, the downtime that the caused in your company, the business interruption element, how long it will take you to remediate the attack and resume normal operation, and how much potential revenue will you lose in this downtime. And finally, the fines and penalties, which, as we saw, are getting bigger and bigger, especially now with the Data Protection Act being implemented. Next slide. So at Beazley, we cover all these costs. So we cover the fees and costs of legal services. So you're getting your lawyers involved in identifying the breach or in handling the customer complaint. We cover the forensic services to determine the cause of a breach, try to stop it or make it or preventing it from becoming bigger. Notification services in some countries, and I think it will be very most likely follow in Jamaica. There is an obligation to notify every customer whose data has been compromised. So the assured will have to set up a structure in place, such as a call center, to call every customer and notify them of the breach. There's also all the credit and monitoring services. So if the data of your customer have been compromised, you need to monitor the credit and identity for a certain period of time after the breach to make sure that it's not being used for fraudulent purposes. And finally, there is the PR and crisis management costs. So when your company is affected by an event like this and it's leaked to the press and everyone hears about it, then you're very likely to suffer from reputational damage, and you need public relation officers, agents, to kind of help you reestablish your reputation. So all of this will be covered also under a cyber policy. Next slide. So the cyber policy is made of two sections. In general, we divide it in a section which is about third-party liability, so the damage caused to third parties, and your own loss as a company, so your first-party loss. The third-party liability covers the data breach, so the theft, loss, and disclosure of sensitive information, a security breach, so a failure to prevent unauthorized access or a denial of service, or an infection in your computers that that spreads a malicious code, or any failure to disclose a breach to any regulator. So that would also be covered under the policy. Also covered are the regulatory and defense penalties. So the fines that you may incur following a data breach, and also all the PCI DSS fines. So when you deal with the main credit card providers such as Visa and MasterCard, then you have to follow the standards of the PCI, which are mandated by the card brands. So if you breach them following any cyber event, then we will cover your costs. And finally, the media liability, that's also in the third-party liability. So if there is, increasingly all companies now are on social media, advertising on LinkedIn, on other means of communication. So if there is a defamation or a libel or a slander or an infringement of copyright or plagiarism, this will also be covered by our policy. And the first party loss is the second section. So we're talking about business interruption, the downtime that we mentioned earlier, dependent business interruption loss. So if you sustain a loss as a result of a breach, which will then put your provider system out of access, so then this will be covered. The cyber extortion, which we talked about, so it's a result of an extortion threat. So we will spend more time on that later because this is mainly becoming the highest risk. And finally, the data recovery costs. So any costs you incur in trying to replace your data or recover it or regain access to it. So next slide. So why do we need cyber insurance? So the number of incidents is so high. Someone mentioned earlier, it's no longer a question of if, it's a question of when. So this is a survey that was conducted in the United States about how, according to industries. So you would notice, for example, that 75% of hospitality clients who were surveyed suffered from hack or malware at some stage in their life. 53% in the retail industry. In the healthcare industry, 39% suffered from unintended disclosure. So it is really affecting all sectors, all industries, all services across the world. And what we're seeing, as I deal with Latin America and the Caribbean, before the common idea was this is very much of a US issue because the US is so litigious. It is no longer the case. We are now seeing huge hacks being operated on large Latin American and Caribbean companies as well. Next slide. So what do we need to assess your cyber risk? So first of all, we need the name, your name, and the activities that you operate and all the subsidiaries that operate under your name. We need all the web domains used to operate your business. So someone earlier mentioned an ethical hacking test. We actually do not carry out the ethical hacking, but we test all the domains for open ports. So if there's an RDC or an RDP or a Samba, so we tell you, okay, you need to close these ports because they're vulnerable to attacks. So we do this before we actually submit a quotation for your insurance. We also ask you for a ransomware questionnaire, which looks at issues such as the multi-factor authentication, whether or not you conduct phishing training to your staff, whether you have backups, if they're encrypted, and if they're stored in remote locations. So all of these issues were mentioned briefly earlier. And the way we work is we have like a traffic light scoring. So we work on green, amber, and red. So if we are satisfied with the answers, then it's a green, then your premium will be much cheaper than if we have like a red indicator. So the better the security, then the cheaper the premium, basically. So a bit of focus on ransomware. So we mentioned earlier, so ransomware is really at the moment a malware that typically enables cyber extortion for financial gains. Criminal can hide links seemingly in normal emails or web pages, and once activated, it prevents users from having access to their files or applications. And obviously, they ask for a payment. Usually, it's in the form of cryptocurrency. The ransomware is a serious, growing cyber threat, affects people, and had made headlines for broader attacks on businesses. And as we said earlier, the growth of home working due to the pandemic contributed to an exponential increase in ransomware attacks. Next slide. So this is an example of a very well-publicized case of ransomware. TravelX in the UK, which is a money exchange travel agent, was suffered a 4.6 million ransom demand that they didn't want to pay. And this occurred to a VPN that was vulnerable and that was reported to TravelX prior to the incident, but however, they did not patch on time. So again, this shows the importance of patching. And in the next slides, if we can pass this one. So this is, for example, the typical ransomware threat that you get in your email. So, we recommend that you start gathering money to pay us, or we'll sell your information to a relevant party. We see in the following slide, also, we see some other examples. The next one, please. So this is also the type of threat that you get. We know who you are. You have that much in assets. We know how much you're worth. We have your information. If you don't pay, then we'll compromise your information. We'll prevent you from having access to the information, or we will filter it on the dark web, for malicious use. So, what we observe from ransomware agents, operators right now is that they have greater visibility into the networks. They do more homework into their victims. Their attacks are more and more sophisticated. And what we saw earlier, there are new threats, such as what we call the doxing, which is the threat to reveal the data on the dark web if you don't pay up. What we also see, which is a very worrying trend, is a rise in attacks against managed service providers. So this can bring down multiple clients at the time. So the attacks happen on the MSP and its customers, which then has access to all the data of all the companies dealing with the MSP. So, and the hackers try to attempt to persuade the MSP to pay up, which will then become, which will have, implication on all its own clients. Next slide, please. So the question is, do we cover ransomware under an insurance policy? Yes, we do. So how? So if it's actually the actual ransom payment in Bitcoin, this is covered under the section cyber extortion. If it's a forensic investigation following the ransomware attack to determine the cause and try to stop it, then this would be covered under the data and network liability section. The cost to restore data would be covered under the data recovery costs. The loss of business due to downtime, this is the business interruption. The response to regulatory inquiries would be under regulatory proceedings and fines. And finally, the individual complaints from the third parties is also covered under the data and network liability. So we provide full cover for ransomware. What we have noticed is, with the increase in number of ransomware attacks, a lot of insurers are now limiting the cover, or they are simply refusing to give it. At Beazley, we are still keen to work with the clients to provide this cover as long as we get the information required. We are convinced that the client's website doesn't have any vulnerabilities, and we are satisfied with all the requirements, of multi-factor authentication and other security measures. So a little bit about the claims trend. I think, we talked a lot about claims, but I thought I would give you some examples. This is the loss of portable device that was non-encrypted. So, I think this was publicized. It was lost on the subway, on the tube in London, and it had backup tapes containing the information of 1.6 million customers, including their names, their social security numbers, their financial information, and it includes the data of 200,000 employees and suppliers. So the insured needed to obtain the legal and forensic crisis management service, the call center, and the mail provider, and the credit control necessary to respond to the incident. So this is where Beazley stepped in and helped them in implementing all these requirements. Another example, if we can go to the next slide, please. So this one is the loss of health data. So 20,000 pediatric patients had their data compromised following a phishing attack. So the employee clicked on the phishing email and gave away their credential, which then launched a malware onto their network. So the data contained patient names, clinical information, phone numbers. Healthcare data tends to be extremely sensitive as well. So we see a lot of attacks on health providers and hospitals, for example. Next slide. So this one is an interesting one. This is a timeline of all the huge, or the large kind of cyber breach events that took place. So it started in 2007 with the TJX. That it announced that more than 45 million credit and debit cards had been stolen from its IT database, and it went on. For example, if we jump to 2013, Yahoo had a huge data breach, which for 3 billion users, and they were fined $35 million. That at the time was a record fine. If we continue to the next slide, all these, I'm sure you've heard about the Equifax data breach in 2017, which was one of the largest cyber crimes related to identity theft. And that also implemented the setting up of, a call center, credit and monitoring operations, which were quite costly for the insurers. 2018 was the Marriott data breach. The Marriott was fined 23 million by the UK Information Commissioner Office. In 2020, there was, the famous attacks on Microsoft, and there was the California Consumer Privacy Act, which goes into effect, which will also mean additional fines for data breach for the US customers. And finally, in 2021, there was the famous Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack, which disrupted for a very short period the distribution of oil and gas into some US states. And also there was the 11 million ransomware by JBS, which was mentioned earlier. JBS is a Brazilian meat company whose systems were completely paralyzed by Revil, the Russian ransomware operators, and they had to pay a record 11 million in fine. So on to the next slide. So this is the number of cases we've been handling. So, as we said, there was a general increase in severity and frequency of insured and uninsured losses. And also, every year we see an increase in the number of incidents. So as of 2020, we passed that figure. We're at 4,500. And in 2021, we've already handled, year to date, we've already handled more incidents than for the full 2020. If we go to the next slide. So I thought this would be an interesting one. So this basically outlines the number of, the ransom, so the claims, cyber claims that are classified by type. So as you will see, it's the ransomware that is the main one with 34% of the cases. So, this tells you, that this is really a trend that we have to deal with going forward. The unintended disclosure and, the business interruption are still happening. They're still taking place, but the ransomware is really now the dominant reason of, cyber claims under an insurance policy. So what does this mean? If we can go to the next slide. So, from your perspective as a client who is seeking cyber insurance, engage early with your broker and with Beazley. Please understand the requirements for additional information, why we're asking you for additional information. I think there is a general trend, the general belief that, just by filling a 3-page proposal form, we are able to give you a price and insure you. I think when it comes to cyber, we need to have a more thorough work, more, underwriting the risk, and we may have a lot of back and forth in asking you additional questions. Beazley is committed to cyber insurance. It remains one of our growth pillars for strategy. But also please understand that this is not just an insurance policy. We're not just indemnifying, but we're also offering you a tool to assist you in managing and reducing your cyber exposure. So all this back and forth that takes place before we actually indicate a price for your insurance is, in a way, helping you to reduce your exposure to any potential cyber incident. I think that was my last slide.
Yes. Thank you so very much, Najib. I can see you guys have a comprehensive solution for cyber insurance, and there's so much to be done in there. I do remember you saying to me, and I don't remember you mentioning it to this morning, but you cover ransomware, and not all insurance companies cover ransomware. Is that correct?
Yes, I did mention earlier, a lot of insurance companies are actually withdrawing from the cover. They are, because there's so many incidents, as we saw earlier, because it's happening on such a regular basis. A lot of them are saying we can no longer cover it. A lot of them are sublimiting the ransomware coverage to very small sublimits. And what we're seeing increasingly now with some of our peers is that they're asking the client to co-insure. So whenever there's a ransomware case, our peers, our competitors will only offer to pay, say, 50% of the final loss. We don't do that. We, as long as we are satisfied with the security measures and we received satisfactory information to all the elements that we've asked, we commit to give full ransomware coverage.
Right. So your first stop is info exchange, get your security done, then you move on to you get your premiums reduced and full coverage.
Exactly. Exactly.
All righty. We do have one question for you. It says here, how can a $50 million ransom be paid out in cryptocurrency and not be traceable to the beneficiary?
Oh, I mean, some of these ransomware payments were traced. So the solar wind one, which affected the US government, they managed to trace them and recover them. But I think, you know, the whole point of cryptocurrency payment is that they're untraceable and they're deregulated. So, you know, I think that's the reason why all the hackers and the hacktivists ask for payments in cryptocurrency.
Okay. All right. I'm not seeing any more questions here specifically for Najib. You did such a spectacular job, Najib. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Danae, can you put up my poll? We just wanted to get a feel for the makeup of our participants. So we're moving on now to the open Q&A for everybody. If we can ask the presenters to open their cameras, and we will go back to asking, answering the questions that we were unable to do earlier. Is Roderick available? Calling on Roderick. Yes.
I'm here.
Okay, good. All righty. Let's see. There are so many questions here. I want to make sure that we answer as many of them as possible. Good morning. This is coming from Keisha Harriet. I noticed your presentation makes specific reference to customers. Are employees also data subjects and therefore governed by the DPA? I think we had answered that before. The answer to that is yes. Are employees specifically referenced in the DPA, or are there specific reference in the act that deals with employees?
There isn't a specific reference, Anne-Marie, as a data subject. Providing the information, you would be under the Act. The question would be depending on what the information is used for and how it's processed, maybe there's an exemption.
Okay.
But I think it's best to err on the side of caution.
All righty. Yes, the presentation will be made available. It's recorded, so we'll be sending out recordings of this presentation, all three presentations to you. Good morning. Where an organization enjoys immunity, okay, is the individual or perpetrator still found liable under the Act?
So it depends. Potentially, yes. You may enjoy immunity from prosecution under your specific act, but depending on what has happened with the data and what the breach may be, you may not have immunity from breaching the provisions of the Data Protection Act. So it will depend on the situation and the specific type of immunity.
Okay, still on you, Roderick. As a Jamaican-based business, will I be restricted in transacting business with Europe/US organizations if I'm not DPA compliant or GDPR compliant?
You would not be restricted. What you would, however, obviously be is more open to risk if you have not put in the proper policies and infrastructure to ensure that you're compliant both with the DPA and the GDPR and any specific requirements in the US.
Okay. Where a public authority is enabled by other regulation to capture sensitive data, does a public authority still need to seek consent in order to comply with the DPA?
That's a very good question. First, it would really depend on the type of authority and how the data is being provided. But yes, under the DPA, you would require to indicate that you are asking for consent and what the data would be used for.
Okay. This question is on cyber insurance. But I think that Najib probably answered this already. It says, are we really protected with regards to total coverage and venue of your customer base? What are your thoughts on cyber insurance? Are you really protected with regards to total coverage and venue of your customer base?
I mean, yeah, I mean, as you're never completely protected, but the idea is that we make the policy evolve to adapt to the latest trends in cyber crimes and to adapt to the latest regulations imposed in terms of, data protection acts. But, I cannot sit here and commit to 100% protection,
Yeah.
There are always some exclusions with the retroactive date. It depends on when the event occurs, So, I'm happy to explain some of the exclusions, but in general, our aim is to give the best coverage.
Right. Okay, moving on down. This is from Rohan. How does this act, I guess that's the DPA, affect the HR department as it relates to resumes or CVs collected?
That actually is a pretty interesting question. So again, one of the questions is, how do you receive that resume or CV? Very often it's sent voluntarily to you. So you don't ask if you don't advertise. A lot of people send their CVs, resumes these days voluntarily. Naturally, there would be implied consent that that information is being shared with you for a particular reason. Really good question. And I think that in the regulations, we may see some more specificity of how you would handle information provided to you where you have not requested it.
All righty. Then Ramoyne wants to know, does government organizations need consent to process your data?
Again, it would depend on the type of organization. There are some organizations you have to provide information with to transact. And I believe the Act does have some exemptions. So it really depends on the entity and the nature of the engagement.
All right, I'm not sure anyone here on the panel can answer this one, but it says here, so each of our executive agencies must have data protection personnel on staff, or will the Jamaican government have a blanket committee?
That's a good question. I don't know that based on the Act currently, yes, each executive agency would be required to have a data protection officer. I don't know that a blanket committee would suffice. Having said that, it is not unusual for a data protection officer to be the data protection officer for more than one entity. So the Act referring to data protection officer doesn't necessarily mean that each person needs to have their unique data protection officer.
Okay. Cherie Simpson wants to know, can the responsibilities of the DPA be shared among team members?
Yes, they can be.
Okay. Okay. How do you guys protect your ports and capabilities from cyber attacks?
How do you protect the ports and capabilities
from cyber attacks?
That's a very, very, very broad question. It really is around the technologies that you're using. And when you say talking ports, I guess you're talking about firewall. That's a little vague though.
It's a little vague.
Yeah,
all right.
Not quite clear on what
I think, David, that we can just talk about wherever you may have a vulnerability, whether it's via email, whether it's via the internet, or it's on the endpoint. It's really about having the various security technologies in place and practices, as well as processes to defend against any attack. So the first thing that you want to do is to make sure that you keep the attackers off your premises, off your crown jewels. So that is why you have security around email. Don't let it get to the actual endpoint if it's malicious. Same thing for the internet. Don't let it get to the endpoint. If you can protect outside of your organization before it actually gets to where your crown jewels are, that is what you want to do. And then in the event that it lands on the actual asset that actually holds your crown jewels, that means your very valuable data, then you want to have proper endpoint detection and response in place, as well as other means of protecting that endpoint. So when we talk about how do we secure it, it's really around different technologies and different security layers that you have to put in place to protect yourself.
Right. Yeah, basically, I think I understand what he's asking. Basically, our approach really is you fight the fight outside of your premises. You don't want to fight the fight, in your backyard or inside your house. You want to fight it out there. So what you do is a lot of prevention. And then in the event that they get in, then you need to take action, like you indicated, on remediate. Yeah, but that's the approach, layered approach. Yeah.
Ondel, I don't know if this is a question for you. This is from Christopher. He's common denominator. Which back-end platforms get hacked most often? Microsoft, AS400, RISC, Unix, mainframe when settling cyber claims. I don't know if you or Najib.
Let us answer it this way, Anne. David spoke about ransomware as a service. So therefore, what he spoke about is finding the weakest link. And it's really about that. So it's not about any specific technology. It could be even something as simple as a home device that is connected to the internet. We talk about operational technology. We talk about IoT. All our simple devices are now being connected to the internet. And if a particular hacker actually gets access to something like that and is connected to our network, then it could be the point of entry. So it's not about AS400. It's not about Windows. It's not about Unix. It's about what vulnerabilities have you identified or not identified, and the ones really and truly that you have not identified and patched are those avenues through which you will be hacked. So it's really about finding, first of all, knowing what do you have within your organization. So you need some form of asset management. Just like in the physical world, you had, the accounting people going around and said, well, that's my desk, that's my chair. The same thing you have to do in the IT world. You have to have IT asset management, so you know what is it that you have. And then you have to now take an inventory, a continuous inventory of what vulnerabilities those assets may have. And of course, do a risk-based prioritization of how am I going to patch it based on what is going on in the wider community in terms of security. So that is how you approach it. And someone asked about penetration testing. The problem that we have with penetration testing is that it's a point in time. And in the cybersecurity world, you find that Microsoft has patch Tuesdays, and different companies have different things that they talk about every week in terms of vulnerabilities coming out. So if you took a point in time and said, well, I've now patched my systems to that point in time, the next day, you now have another set of vulnerabilities. So David spoke about continuous monitoring and continuous patch management. That is what we believe in rather than just a point in time penetration test.
Okay. This is a pretty long one. My name is Emerson Bryan, a Jamaican information management professional living and working in Barbados. One of the biggest challenges I see in terms of the DPA is that of contact tracing for businesses being required to solicit the personal identifying information of persons in largely paper-based processes. for COVID-19 and without any provisions for the retention and disposal of this information. As you know, under GDPR, this would be a no-no, and the Jamaican DPA is intended to be compliant with EU rules on data protection. We have looked at vulnerabilities for IT platforms, but what about those in hybrid or paper systems? What's your take on this system as it relates to the Caribbean, given that digital transformation is moving ahead? Yes, but most processes are still in hybrid systems due to legal requirements. Roderick, this sounds like something for you.
Yes, it's a very, very thought-provoking question, very pertinent to the Caribbean. And we looked at the issue in preparing for this presentation. In fact, the Act does not limit the processing of data to digital processing, even though it speaks about automated processing, etc. So Emerson is right. You handling data on a paper-based or hybrid system still brings you under the DPA. And so he raises some very, very important questions because he's right. We don't yet have the regulations that deal with disposal. And while from the point of view of public health and the various disaster risk management orders that Jamaica has put in place and other countries throughout the world to handle the crisis that is COVID-19, the question becomes, how do you process the data? How do you handle it? And how do you dispose of it? So it's really very important. And I would expect that in the regulations, we will see some more obligations as to how we deal with that. But for right now, Emerson, I think what one would have to do is use one's best judgment, use proper policies, and perhaps follow the GDPR in terms of the guideline of how you would handle that for the time being.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so very much. We're losing a few of our participants. I just want to ask you that if you're leaving, please fill out that survey that we have at the end of this. It is our only way to find out how we're doing and how to best serve you in the future. So it only takes a few minutes, a couple of minutes. And so we're asking you to do that. There's a question here from Debbie. I hope Debbie is still around. She says, referring to Najib, who said he's providing security for companies. How are they able to do that in order to offer us the service?
Security for companies. No, what we actually do is we test the website for vulnerabilities. It's so we just determine some of the open ports. Again, it has its advantages, but it's also as Andel was saying, it gives you a picture at one point in time. It doesn't mean it's going to be that way the following day, but at least it gives us an idea of how many ports are vulnerable, and we could determine our risk for getting an extortion, a ransomware attack. So that's the kind of security we provide. The other is we ask, we have a ransomware questionnaire that we ask the client to fill in, and if some of the answers are negative, we tell them, such as one of the most important one is the MFA, multi-factor authentication. We ask them to implement it. So this is the kind of security we give.
Yeah. One thing to remember, everyone, is that your security posture is really the sum of a number of things across a number of areas, across all of the possible vulnerabilities. So it's not any one particular thing. Somebody had asked about, penetration tests. I mean, again, it's a point in time, and that gets stale every day after the test is completed. So it's really a sum of the areas that we've been talking about, and as Ondel has mentioned, to provide that level.
And a continuous monitoring.
Precisely, yeah. Have to. There was one thing quickly as well that I had mentioned earlier about putting data in the cloud and privacy and so on. There's one thing that I wanted to mention, which the fine print of the cloud provider's contract with you is this thing they call the shared responsibility model. where the provider is responsible for the uptime of the infrastructure, where you, Mr. Customer, you're responsible for securing the data that you put in there. So it's not a matter of hand it over to them and then that's it. Those data security measures that you have for your on-premises data also apply there in the cloud. So it's not set it and forget it over there. Just wanted to just add that.
That's a good point, David, actually.
All righty. Does the upcoming Data Protection Act include guidance on the data owner's rights to their data access and portability of their data? How do companies make sure they comply with these aspects? Roderick?
Right, so it does provide for the data subject's right to access their data. I'm not sure that it deals with portability specifically, but you can ask the data controller, how are you maintaining my data? And if you're not satisfied, you can make a complaint to the Information Commissioner. So it does provide that in a specific section of the Act.
Let me see here. When does the data become the responsibility of a data controller? Is it once stored by the company or once the information is collected?
Right, it's once the information is collected.
Okay. All righty. Does the Act make provision for any form of DPO certification program?
Good question. Currently, it does not. And I don't know that the regulations would specify that. What it does say is that you must ensure that your DPO is adequate to do the job required. So it presumes that the person would have, or entity would have, some amount of training and experience in the space. Obviously, when you're looking at the standards that will obtain under the Data Protection Act, certification of your IT team, the people who will be directly dealing with the obligations under the Act, can only enhance your ability to show the Information Commissioner or your data subjects that in fact you have put in adequate policies and you have adequate systems dealing with handling data.
All righty, here's an interesting one. What Michael wants to know, what would you say to companies planning to use insurance to cover for their lack of compliance with the DPA? Here's somebody who's thinking.
Oh, there, Mike.
I'd love to know who asked that.
That's why I call him Dushra.
Robert, you want to take that?
No, I'm not touching that one with that 20-foot pole. I'm going to hand that one off. I'm strategically going to hand that one off to Najib. I'm not touching that one.
I think if you start telling an insurer that you're concerned about not being compliant with the DPA, then it's a bad starting point for us because you're not taking your risk too seriously. So yeah, I don't think it would be very attractive for us to protect this client.
Okay, I think what is it when? Okay, I think we answered that question. All righty, I think somebody had asked for us to put up, Brian, if you could put up the last slide in Roderick's presentation, his takeaways. I think it was the last thing that he had said, that he could put those up as, final takeaways, right? Somebody wanted to see that. But final takeaways: confirm whether your business needs to comply with the DPA, access your data processing activities and obligations, access your data processing activities and obligations falls under the DPA. Maybe I'm not reading that right.
Whether it falls on.
Oh, whether. Okay.
Whether, correct.
and make sure you have the relevant agreements in place. And of course, develop proper policies and governance. You want to add anything? You want to clarify? Oh,
there are a few more. I think, Anne-Marie, the point is that you have to educate yourself. You have to assess both your IT infrastructure, the hardware, the agreements you currently have in place, and your internal policies. David made the point in his presentation, very important, that the leadership, both of the private sector and the public bodies that are going to fall under this act, need to step up, and they need to recognize that the obligations and the liability goes right to the top. So it's really important that on a company basis, on an organizational basis, you're not just looking at your IT policy. You're not just looking at your privacy policy. You have to be looking at how do we as a company, as a business, as a public body handle data? How do we treat this data? How do we treat that data subject? And it has to be right through the organization. It's not simply a minute in a board meeting saying, we've taken advice and the IT controller now has their instructions and we're gone. You have to demonstrate that you are really taking it seriously, and particularly for Najib, for Beazley, for Fraser, Fontaine, to assess properly your risk. Your premium will be significantly lower if you're able to demonstrate that throughout your organization, you have looked carefully and comprehensively at how you handle these risks and obligations.
Thank you. And the final question is from Hyacinth. How will the DPA affect companies such as debt collections agencies who may receive data from institutions such as banks?
Good question. It affects those entities directly, because when you receive that information, it will contain clearly personal data, and in some instances was qualified as sensitive data. So you will fall under the Act as a data controller, and you will have to ensure you have the proper policies and infrastructure in place.
Oh, one last question that just came in from Levon. He says, as stated earlier, malware on endpoints can find their way onto a company's network through a VPN. Is there a way to segment employee access in an effort to limit vulnerabilities or risks? Or is it a case where once malware accesses the network, the entire network is compromised? Ondel, this sounds like a question for you.
There's a way to segment, and you know, in our next you know, segment of our cybersecurity seminar series, we will talk more about secure remote access. And basically what you'd have to do is to not let them onto the network in the first place. I think VPN has served us well, but the problem with VPN is that it actually extends the network to wherever that user is. So therefore, if you have 100 users working remotely, you have extended your network to 100 different locations. And therefore, the issues or the vulnerabilities or the different security environment that actually describes those 100 locations can actually affect you. So therefore, you may think that you know, you're being secure, but what you have done is to extend your trust boundary out to 100 different places, and that's not good. So in our next presentation in our cybersecurity seminar series, we'll talk about how to do it in a way that even if the endpoint is compromised in such a secure remote access way, you can actually limit the blast radius just to the application, and not only just to the application, but you don't let them onto the network. Hence, if they try to ping, if they try to discover anything, then the bad guys aren't able to discover it. So different times, different technologies, making you work safer, working from anywhere. And just one other point, Henry, I think most companies are thinking, you know, DPA not passed as yet, DPA 2 years away. Why do I care about security? Why should I care about privacy? It is very important to note that ransomware is happening today. Ransomware as a service is actually out there, where anyone, even without, you know, cyber attack skills, can actually go onto a platform and just say, find the weakest link. And if you're the weakest link, you're going to be the one that gets attacked. So security is something that all companies from the board level right down to the employee should be concerned about, because if an incident happens, you could be out of business. And then from privacy standpoint, if you have a situation where you're collecting my personal information or the personal information of your customers, then you do have a responsibility and are accountable if anything goes wrong, even before, at this stage, even before the DPA comes into effect. So when should you take action? Our opinion is now.
I want to back that up, Ondel, and remind everyone that the GDPR has taken effect since 2018. So you potentially have our diaspora in the US, in the UK, in other areas in the EU that are already doing business with you. So you do have those obligations to them. If they're not happy with how you've treated their data, they have rights now. So even though our DPA is following on your obligations and the mindset, the preparation, your infrastructure, it needs to change now. So I think that just reinforces on that. We had a discussion before in one of our internal sessions where you actually did make that point as well. So I want to, reinforce it.
Anne-Marie, I just like to just to reinforce this a little bit for people who are thinking, oh, I can wait. Me, like most Jamaicans, I'm afraid of dog, right? Think of the data security issues as the bad dog right at your foot, about to bite you. And in my mind, what is worse than one bad dog biting you? Two. The second one is this DPA act that's running up the road, coming after you. You need to deal with the dog at your foot and deal with the other one that is coming. So there's no point of delay, no reason for delay.
Very creatively put, and a good point for us to end on. Well, thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for attending. We've used up much more of your time than we intended. For that, we do apologize, but there was so much to go through. I think we underestimated the time, but we hope that you found the information interesting and thought-provoking. The questions continue to come in, but on security, again, we're asking you to just register for the next series of the next webinar that we'll be having, and it will be on secure internet access and secure private access on October the 13th. We promise we won't keep you too long for that. And yeah, I think that's it. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to Najib. Thank you to Roderick and David Ondel and Robert, Fraser, Fontaine and Kong, Gordon McGrath, Gordon McGrath, and attorneys at law. Thank you so much for joining along with us and Info Exchange to bring this event to you. I hope you have enjoyed it. Have a good rest of the day and
Thank you.
blessings.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
For the okay.